So I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and really never left. I went to Cleveland Heights High School, where I was a poor student. I was told not to go to college, maybe trade school. Anyhow, I went to Miami of Ohio, in Oxford, Ohio. It was a wonderful school. It was Phi Beta Kappa there, and I worked very hard to do that, and totally changed my persona when I was in college, and worked toward medical school. Got into a number of medical schools, but chose to stay in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve because my role model, my uncle, who was a internist and who I tried to be like in every way. I went to Case Western Reserve University, and I worked very hard. You know, I saw these guys from Harvard and Princeton, and I wasn't quite sure that I could do what they did. I came from Little Miami, so I just worked harder than they did, and I was able to do very well. I was AOA, and I liked surgery because my uncle, this uncle I spoke about, seeing that I could either be a juvenile delinquent or a professional, introduced me in my teens to working in a hospital, first as an orderly at age 16, and then as a surgery assistant, and I did that all through college and summers of medical school. So by the time I took my surgery clerkship in medical school, I was very facile with tying knots and doing things that I wasn't supposed to do when I was a surgical assistant. And I did well in my surgery clerkships and decided to go into surgery. I wasn't sure where I was going to do my residency, but ended up doing it at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, which was one of my first choices. And I was happy because I was just married in medical school. In those days, in medical school, at my second year, I was one of the few people that wasn't married. And everyone said, well, why aren't you married? So I figured I ought to date somebody and get married, and I did. I found a magnificent person, and it was the luckiest choice of my life. And I say lucky because when I was 20 years old, who knew what the heck you were doing? But for whatever reason, I was lucky to meet Jackie, and we got married when we were 22, and we're going to be married 48 years this month. So that was the luckiest thing, and she's been the biggest influence on my life. You have to state that right away. Everything good that I've accomplished is with her guidance and her advice and support. And as I was going through my surgical residency, which was 36 on and 12 off, it was every other night's call. You know, people think you're going to love it. It was terrible. I mean, it was horrible. And I think residents who think that this is supposed to be fun are misleading themselves. It's tough. It's hard work. And there are times when you get in the doldrums, you have to sort of look beyond and say, what am I going to be able to do when I'm done with this? So I remember standing one day looking in the mirror. I was a PG3, and we had to pick our elective for the coming year. And I said, darn, I don't want to work this hard. I want to pick something that's not so tough. And I saw those gastroenterologists in the ICU trying to do endoscopy. I said, it's perfect. I'll just do this endoscopy thing, and I'll blow off for a few months, and it'll be easy. And so I signed up for it. And then the year went by, and I was a PG4, and it was time to go. And the week before, I called the gastroenterologist at the university, and I said, where do I meet you? They said, there was a mistake. We're not training a surgeon to do this. We don't have a spot for you. And that got my attention. So I went to my chair. He wasn't the chair of the department. He was the chief of general surgery. His name was Charlie Hubey. And he was put off by this as well. And he says, you know, I know a gastroenterologist who trained around here. And he's in Canton, Ohio, which was an hour-and-a-half drive from Cleveland then. And he said, this guy is a superbly trained gastroenterologist doing a ton of endoscopy, and he'd love to train somebody, but he has nobody to train. So I called him. His name was Jim King. I went to Jim, and Jim trained me for almost 5 months. I drove every day back and forth to Canton, Ohio, and we did about 20 procedures a day. And he was better than anybody at the university, and he was so slick. And as good of a gastroenterologist as he was a wonderful physician. So we learned a lot of medicine. We talked about diseases. He was up on all of the current therapies and the basic science, and he got me interested in societies. He said, you must join the ASGE, the American Society for Gastrointestinal Endoscopy. We're going to go to the meeting. I'll go with you. We're going in May. This was February. So I was interested then. I came back after training with him, and I'd done about 500 procedures. And I said to the head of gastroenterology there, could I help work with your residents and teach them endoscopy? And I told him what I had been able to accomplish. He said, you will not touch our instruments. We are not going to let a surgeon do endoscopy. So I went and told my chairman, Bill Holden, who's a wonderful man, this is what's going on. He said, look, I'd love to buy you a scope, but I don't have the money right now to buy a scope. It was like $5,200. And he said, try to work at the VA. So I did a few cases at the VA, but I wasn't doing much. They had a scope there. And then December came around, and I was at a party with my wife's family and a bunch of people. And I told this story to my brother-in-laws and my mother-in-law, and I just told them what was going on. And the next day I was on call at the VA, and I got a phone call from my mother-in-law. And she said to me, go buy yourself a Christmas present, a Hanukkah present. She said, go buy yourself a scope. We're buying it for you. And that scope made all the difference. I still have it. I came in, I put the word out I would come in day or night. And the internists at University Hospital couldn't believe it, that somebody would actually come in the middle of the night and do a GI bleeder or do the case right away when they were asked to. And at the end of 2 years, when I had finished my residency, I literally put the GI department out of business. The internists, the private internists, were calling me for every case. And in that final year, Dr. Holden, the chairman, called me, and he said, I finally came up with an American Cancer Society grant for $5,000 so I can give you back the money. I said, thank you, Dr. Holden. And I went out and bought an ERCP scope. I didn't give it back to my mother. So we developed, as I started doing ERCP, there was nobody to train you then. I watched videos, and Peter Cotton, who I love, is a great friend. I watched his videos, and we did ERCP, did it all ourselves. No nurse even helped us. We set up the whole table ourselves, went down to X-ray. My fellow residents would be there to hand me stuff. And so by 1976, we were doing upper, lower, and ERCP. I was then hired to be the chief of surgical endoscopy at University Hospitals. That was my job, as well as doing general surgery, did everything. I wrote a book about a procedure that we developed, and I'll get into that in a minute, about PEG. And that first book that we wrote, I dedicated to my mother-in-law. So in that capacity as head of surgical endoscopy in 1979, I was doing all surgical endoscopy, including babies. And Mike Gouderer had been recruited as a pediatric surgeon then. And we would stand there together while I did the endoscopy, and we had a dark room, and we noticed the light shining from the baby's abdomen when we did upper endoscopy on them, because they had a thin abdominal wall. And Michael had always, he was an innovative guy, always wanted to do a minimally invasive gastrostomy, but we put our heads together. I remember standing in the hall one day and figured out how to puncture with a needle and grab it with this and that, and how to make a tube. And we did the first PEGs together in 5 brain-damaged babies who were infants, who were scheduled for open gastrostomy prior to going to long-term nursing care. And we talked to the mothers. There were no IRBs that I remember then. We talked to the mothers and said, look, we're going to do a gastrostomy. We may have to open the baby, but we're going to try to poke a needle and just do it with the endoscope, and if it doesn't work, we'll just open. And they all worked. A few months after that, I went to Mount Sinai Hospital across the street. I was 32 years old, and the chairman at that time was a cardiac surgeon, and without giving it a lot of thought, he had a problem at this affiliated hospital, couldn't hold the chairman. And he said, look, it's a Jewish hospital, you're a Jewish guy, and you're a good teacher, go be the chairman over there. And they knew me there because I had worked as a scrub nurse for years, can you imagine? But it worked out, and I learned to manage people, I learned to be an administrator, and I learned to teach residents. And I was the chief of surgery there for 18 years. We did PEG in adult for the first time there, and we did a ton of PEGs and modified it and improved the equipment. And so that was the beginning. At the same time, ironically, endoscopy and surgery was being recognized. There were some very good people who wanted to work with surgeons who were leading ASG at the time. A fellow named Jerry Way, who was from New York, a wonderful endoscopist. Mel Shapiro from Los Angeles. There was even a surgeon who was a few years older than me, named Ted Schrock, who was the president later of SAGES, and he became president of ASGE. And they wanted surgical involvement, so I was on committees in ASGE, and I was very happy with my ascendancy in ASGE. So here it is around 1980, and the American Board of Surgery says surgeons must have an experience in endoscopy. But who was going to do it for them? Well, most of them were, as they are in many cases now, rotated out to the GI service where they were able to watch endoscopy. So I decided I was going to give courses in endoscopy at Mount Sinai. We had a great laboratory. And we had courses in basic flexible endoscopy. So who was my faculty? Ken Ford, magnificent leader in endoscopy. George Berci came. Rick Green came. Tom Dent, who later became president of SAGES, came. We had Walter Gaisford, who you may not know, who is one of the most elegant surgical endoscopists we ever had. And he was in Salt Lake City. He used to bring his violin and play in his room every night. We would hear the beautiful music he played. We had Willie Webb, who was from Opelika, Alabama, most elegant endoscopist and superb teacher. And these were the best guys in the surgical endoscopy world. And they all came, and we taught this course to residents every year. And then a group of surgeons got together under the guidance of Gerald Marks. Gerald Marks was a colorectal surgeon in Philadelphia, and he was upset because as good as ASGE was, they didn't want the surgical papers on their program too often. They didn't want to involve some surgeons in their leadership. They were progressive in a way, but surgical thinking wasn't a part of what they wanted to do. And so Gerald Marks was incredibly innovative, and he got a group of surgeons together, and these guys in about 1980 included John Collar from Boston, and Ken Ford, and John Van Sant, and Jim Lind from Virginia, and a whole number of others. And they got together, decided they were going to start a society, SAGES. SAGES was meant to be a place where surgeons could get together and talk about the surgical way we do endoscopy. And at first, when I was involved, I sort of said, you know, these guys are renegades. I'm doing so well in ASGE. Why do I need this headache? These guys are like rebels. But I went to the meetings, and I got involved, and I joined. I remember our first get-together and meeting, and my eyes just opened up, because the problems that we talked about and the uses of endoscopy that we described were totally different from an ASGE meeting. Even then, there were people from community practice talking about how to decompress a partial bowel obstruction using flexible endoscopy, or how to use it for GI bleeding. Ken Ford talked about using it in acute lower GI bleeding. The thought process was surgical, not medical, and I realized this is different. And so SAGES kept going. The meetings were small. We had a couple hundred people at the meetings, and the presidents were wonderful. We had board meetings. Jerry ran them. A lot of them were in Philadelphia. And early on, we recognized that we needed some managerial help. And there was this woman named Barbara Saltzman. Barbara Saltzman became our administrator. And thank God, because she not only led us through the early years, but helped us grow as we matured, and was our conscience and our soul to this day. Later on, she would meet and marry George Berci, and now she's Barbara Berci. But Barbara has been the mother of SAGES. First of all, there weren't a lot of surgeons who were doing endoscopy at a high level in the late 70s and early 80s. There were a handful. And so I was already involved with ASG, and I had developed PEG, which was pretty well known. And so I was invited to be on the SAGES board. I was one of the earliest members. Somewhere along the line, I became president of SAGES. It was the greatest honor of my life. And I couldn't believe that it happened. An interesting time occurred because that was around 1990, we changed the president's rotation at the American College of Surgeons. That's where we held our meetings. Then we decided we were going to have our own meeting in the spring. And so Barbara said, well, we have to change the president at that meeting. So I ended up being president for 18 months rather than just a year. And I remember we had a meeting in Louisville, and it was about 1989. And this crazy Frenchman, Jacques Parissat, he had a video with him, and he didn't get it on the program, but he wanted to show it. So we agreed to let him show it in the exhibit hall. It was a video of laparoscopic cholecystectomy that he had done. And we saw it, and our mouths hit the floor, and the world was never the same. And SAGES, which had 300 members at the beginning of my presidency, had 2,000 at the end. So it grew that fast in 18 months because everybody wanted to get in it. The meetings were so big that we couldn't handle all the people. And it was due to lap chole. But something else was happening in SAGES as well. Because most surgical societies at the time, the regional societies like the Central Society, the Southern Society, the Southeastern Society, all these societies, SSAT, they were academic sort of societies, and they had a certain degree of decorum and a hierarchy. If you were older and more accomplished, you certainly ruled the day, and the younger people were just happy to be seen there and didn't say too much. And in SAGES, something else happened. Again, Barbara's influence was very important, and also the people who developed these procedures were very young. And so SAGES developed a flat, as they say in business, a flat profile. We weren't hierarchical, we were very flat organization, and even though we had officers, the people on the committee were encouraged to get involved when they were very young, and we had parties that emphasized interaction and fun, and still do to this day. And so people would come to SAGES. It was like a vacation. We had laughing and we had joking. We did a song fest. And the Japanese, and we say it with tongue-in-cheek, they made up this song, We Are the SAGES, which is based on We Are the World.
We are the world. We are the SAGES. We are the one who make a brighter day. So let's start treating.
To this day, I get tears in my eyes when I hear that song. It's become our anthem, because everyone holds hands and sings the song at the end of the meeting and bonds us together as a society. So we are different than every other society. What's interesting is that somewhere along the line in the last decade, we realized that we weren't just about minimally invasive surgery, we were about gastrointestinal surgery in general, and our name changed. Originally, it was Society of Gastrointestinal Endoscopic Surgeons, and now we changed it to Society of Gastrointestinal and Endoscopic Surgeons. So we made them both part of SAGES. It was a small change which had a great significance. I think our membership is close to 7,000 now. SAGES is about involving everybody. We look at government relations, we look at the practical issues, we look at new technology, we adapt new ways to teach, we look at new procedures critically, and we have fun doing all of this. You can be a past president, or you can be a guy who's a year out of training, and you can have equal impact at the meeting. You can present your work, you can have fun at the party, you can be involved in committees. SAGES is very special. It's special because of the people, it's special because of its culture. It's really also about the leadership. I mentioned Barbara, and Barbara is and was magnificent. And Sallie Matthews, who she's brought along. And I remember Sallie when she first began, she was an assistant to Barbara. She was a great participant in our song fests and in our conferences, and she would come to the off-site meetings we had. And a number of years ago, she took over for Barbara running the day-to-day operations of SAGES, and she's magnificent. SAGES is a family. They know about your good days and your bad days, and they're there to support you. It's not just about a meeting. The journal has become a remarkable journal with a great impact internationally. So endoscopy really began in Japan. I mean, in many ways, because they developed these fiber optic instruments through Olympus and Machida and other instrument makers. And in Japan, the surgeons are very involved in endoscopy. So early in my career, I had the opportunity to go to Japan to speak about PEG. Choichi Sagawa, who's one of the early members of SAGES, he lives in Detroit. He's trained more people than I ever want to talk about. And Choichi trained me to eat sushi before I went to Japan. And I met with, at that time in Tokyo, Manabu Yamamoto and Dr. Suzuki and Dr. Itazuki and Dr. Yamakawa and all of the wonderful people in Japan who were leaders in surgery. The Japanese started coming to the SAGES meeting, but the thing that really got the Japanese to feel warm about SAGES was the sing-off that we had. Because the sing-off invited everybody to come up and participate, and at first it was almost serious. People, you know how it started? I was president, and a guy named John Sakier was involved with SAGES as well, and he was at Washington, D.C., and his wife at that time, Shelley, had a background in music, and so we decided to have sort of a spoof. We would on rap singing, and we got up there, and I was giving a talk at the banquet, and as I talked, I took off my tie, I took off my jacket, took off my shirt, dropped my pants, and I was wearing this tie-dye scrub suit. And all of the other guys came out, John Hunter and Nat Soper and Lee Swanstrom and George Berci and a whole bunch of other, and we were called the Lap Rappers, and we did this thing and people went crazy. Well, that started a sing-off every year, and at first people would get up and they'd sing serious songs and stuff. And then it got crazy because every institution wanted to have representation, and the Japanese came and they practiced. And the Japanese came on, and every year at the final thing, they would do this magnificent tour de force song. They became part of our DNA. I think their impact is in terms of giving us courage to do procedures that we might not have normally done. I mean, the Japanese are far ahead. Haru Inoue doing the poem procedures. People there doing the endoscopic submucosal dissection. They came and helped to teach us at our courses how to do these procedures. And they took our people there and taught them as well. SAGES became an international society, and we had members from every country you can imagine. The people who were in SAGES became internationally involved because it was a brotherhood. Then people from all over the world started moving around. Some of them came to the United States. Some of our people, like Lee Swanstrom, started working in France. And so the international camaraderie is incredible. To this day, the people from IRCAD, Silvana Peretta, Jacques Marisco, the relationships are so rich between us, between SAGES and EAES and the others. It's incredible. And the world is smaller, and SAGES started it. So that's another group. The Central and South American people were slower to get involved, but the Mexicans, their society has great meetings every year, and the people from there, the people from Colombia, Argentina, Chile, they're all involved with SAGES. They come up, we go there, and have courses. During the period of notes, we had Zoron having courses in notes, and in Brazil and Peru, we had great work in Peru. I mean, it just was never ending. I could go on and on and on and talk about the individuals from each of these places, and it's a travelogue. It's a great camaraderie. So one of the things that you have to recognize is we grew and we matured. There was always a cost, and we needed support economically. And in terms of the technology that was developing, I don't think you can talk about the growth of SAGES without talking about the support of industry. SAGES early on recognized this and started something, and Gerald Marks was right in there, something called the Corporate Council. We recognized that we had problems where we needed industry, but we recognized that they had issues about us. And we wanted to talk to them about that on a one-to-one basis, and so we developed the corporate council. And that was valuable at that time. We also went to industry for supporting our educational projects, our courses, and our fellowships. And to this day, we have great relationships. And the personal relationships, I have to say, with Olympus in the earliest days of flexible endoscopy, Mike Obsfeld, Mark Donahue, and Mr. Morishima from Japan, and Terada from Japan, they were all very helpful to SAGES. The Pentex people were there. The Fuji people were always there to help us as well. And then we had, when laparoscopy started, you couldn't ignore the people from Storz. Mrs. Storz is just an angel. She's a guardian angel of SAGES. She's always been there when we were in trouble, when we need help. She's given us fellowships, course support, technical support, and they're part of the SAGES family. To this, in the United States, we have Charlie Wilhelm and those folks, but the newer companies are also involved, and you can't, every new company that develops has been approached by SAGES and helped SAGES. U.S. Surgical, for example, and now U.S. Surgical is part of Medtronic, and Medtronic is huge, but they still focus on what became Covidien, on their SAGES commitment, and they're with us every moment. And Ethicon has been part of our educational basis, and they helped us do our first courses at the Ethicon Institute in Cincinnati. So as we go along, we have to recognize that we couldn't do this without our corporate partners. Ironically, our corporate partners become our friends, and we depend on them, and we grow old with them and mature with them. And some of our best times have been with our corporate partners. Before SAGES got involved, I was having these courses at Mount Sinai in Cleveland. We did colonoscopy, upper endoscopy. We even had a model for ERCP, and George Berci was off in the corner teaching us laparoscopy before we had video laparoscopy. And we developed a syllabus which was quite extensive on flexible endoscopy, and SAGES came to me and said, "Can we use your course as a SAGES course?" I said, "Sure, we'll put the SAGES name on the course," because it's all SAGES members giving the course. I never thought of it. They're SAGES courses now. So they became SAGES courses. And they were held at Mount Sinai. And then Ethicon came to me and they said, "We want to get into the business of courses and education. We built this building in Cincinnati. And could you run these first courses there? And there'll be SAGES courses, and we need a syllabus, by the way. Can we use your syllabus?" And so we started having these courses, and I don't know how many years I was the director of those courses. And I think back to those courses, and the people who came through them, and I laugh because the residents who came through them became professors later. But they were halcyon courses because they did two things. They taught skills to a lot of residents from some of the best teachers in the country. And number two, they established SAGES as an organization that had hands-on training. Nobody did it before us. We were the first. Hands-on training. Now it's very common, and still no one does it better than we do. In the early days, it was all flexible endoscopy. That's what SAGES was. We'd teach them how to take out a polyp, or we'd teach them how to do colonoscopy. We even got simulation involved, and we built simulators there. And flexible endoscopy was in a separate room. And at first it was of equal size, and then it shrunk a little bit as the laparoscopic revolution broadened. It went from lap chole to teaching how to do Nissens and lap colons and Hellers and everything. So the laparoscopic overwhelmed flexible for a long time. And now we're switching back to having courses in flexible again, where we teach POEM and ESD and EMR. So obviously you have to go with the times, and you have to see what's needed at that time. But flexible was what we did in the beginning. When people ask me, what do you think the greatest contribution in your career is? They continue your legacy and they teach other people. One of my junior residents said, "Could I spend 6 months with you?" It was Tom Stellato, was one of my first fellows. Bill Schuchart, another fellow, spent a few months with me learning colonoscopy and upper endoscopy. Paul Preby, who's at Metro Hospital in Cleveland, spent time with me, learned ERCP, and these were my early fellows, my residents who would finish and spend time with me. And then an outside guy came to me, and his name was David Duppler. And he was from a place that was crazy, Portland, Maine. Where the heck is Portland, Maine? I went up there one time as visiting professor. I didn't know where it was. He came to me, and this guy was an angel, a magnificent man. Been very active in SAGES since there, and he learned to do all that I could teach him. But more than that, he taught me he was a magnificent human being. And Duppler continues to do the highest level of flexible endoscopy. Here was fellowship selection. Somebody would say, there was this guy named John Mellinger, and he would say, I'd like to do a fellowship with you. And I'd say, okay, seems like a good guy, and I'll take you. And that was it. John Mellinger came just at the time we were starting Lab Coley. And John Mellinger could have been a minister, but he turns to be a doctor. He's got the soul of a clergyman. He's a magnificent educator and a wonderful human being. John helped me learn laparoscopic surgery, and we taught him all the ERCP and flexible endoscopy. I had Bruce MacFadyen was my fellow. He came to me from Frank Moody in Houston. He sent him, teach him. Bruce MacFadyen came and learned ERCP and flexible endoscopy and went on to teach it. He became president of SAGES. We had Rob Fanelli, who went on to be a leader and very active in SAGES. Just as I was going from Mount Sinai to the Cleveland Clinic, I had a fellow for a year, and he was the first one I kept for a year. Was this strange guy named Brian Dunkin. And he was just a terrific surgeon with good judgment and great skills. And Brian helped me transition to the Cleveland Clinic, and was a great, he was like my partner. And we worked together for a year, and Brian went on to be, again, president of SAGES. That was 2. Jeff Hazey was my fellow. Jeff Hazey went on to be the chief of surgical endoscopy, first at East Carolina, and now for many years at Ohio State University, a leader in notes and great at ERCP. I missed one fellow who I trained at Mount Sinai. Let me regress a bit. He was a slow learner, so he spent 27 years with me, first as my fellow and as my partner, Gerald Marks, who's like my son. And he's also going to be president of SAGES. So that'll be 3 presidents of SAGES that I had the opportunity to train. So then I went over to University Hospital and recruited Gerald Marks to come work with me. And we trained people like Jonathan Pearle, who's in Maryland. Ben Poulouse came to us from Vanderbilt. He was sent by Holtzman. He said, you can train him, but you got to send him back. He was an MPH. The first one I ever worked with was an MPH. They can write papers before you do the experiment. Anyhow, Ben was magnificent, and he did go back to Vanderbilt and has been a leader there. A good number of them have trained other people who have become leaders. So Dunkin, who went to Miami, ended up training Jose Martinez, who is a leader in flexible endoscopy and ERCP in Miami. What you find is that the tree grows, and that was the whole idea. So the fellows that I've had have been great and served SAGES well. They've all been involved in SAGES. So the greatest joy was having a SAGES course at the last SAGES meeting on flexible endoscopy and sitting in the audience and seeing that the entire panel was made up of my fellows. So it's really a very rewarding thing. Mike Rosen is my partner, but I had the opportunity during my time at the Cleveland Clinic to take residents to work in the lab. Dave Ratner called me up and said, I have this resident, he's a good guy, wants 2 years in the lab, can he work with you? I said, sure, send him along and I'll interview him. And so I interviewed this guy named Mike Rosen, and he told me his story, and Mike seemed like a good guy. I said, fine, you have the job. And after we were done, he looked and he says, you know my father. I said, I do. He said, Arnie Rosen. Well, his father, Arnie Rosen, was a year or so ahead of me in my residency when I was at Case Western Reserve. There was a day when Arnie was supposed to give grand rounds, and he, for whatever reason, he was ill and couldn't, and they said, can you give the grand rounds? And the grand rounds that I gave got me my job. It was on flexible endoscopy. Mike Rosen is a superstar. He has ended up training many of my fellows in abdominal wall reconstruction, and that's a skill that they've learned as well as endoscopy, and that's very important right now. So I think that we all learn from mentors. Mentors are very important. Role models are just as important. A mentor and role models are not necessarily the same. A mentor can guide you, teach you, and direct you, but a role model is somebody who you watch and you say, I want to be like that guy. Walter Pories was a great role model. When I was a medical student and later a resident, he was the chief at what we call Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital. It's now Metro Health. And Walter was a young man. He was innovative, he was thoughtful and entertaining, and he had a wonderful soul. And as I watched him teach and as I watched him administrate, he had many pearls to teach that weren't medical. He would always say, when you run a department and you're a leader, you should protect your elders there, the elder staff. Make sure they're protected and they're not threatened, but at the same time promote your younger staff. Very important lesson that I learned from Walter. When I became a chairman of a department, many of the lessons that I learned that I think helped me become successful were learned from Walter. And to this day I'm learning from Walter, because Walter Pories never stops being relevant. He is now in his mid-80s and he has NIH grants and is still relevant in lecturing, and inspires me, who's 70, to look forward to the future, because I think if we want to remain relevant, he's shown that you can and should. The way I met George Berci was that in 1975, when I was starting to become interested in endoscopy, we did peritoneoscopy. We called it peritoneoscopy then. And we did it under local anesthesia, and we did it with air. We insufflated air at first. I wanted to buy a scope. I had a little grant from my brother-in-laws for $2,500, and I didn't know what to buy. So I had read about this fellow who was working in California at Cedars-Sinai, who had originally come from Australia, George Berci, and I called him and asked him what to buy. And he told me a Storz scope to buy, and that was the beginning of our relationship. George was always someone who was never satisfied with the status quo. If you looked at a scope and you showed him a picture that you had taken, he'd say, you can improve that picture by doing this to the image. You can get more light if you use this camera. What if we could create a flash at the end of the camera? And so he was never satisfied with where you were today. And he, as I said, worked with the Storz company because he was the one who had worked with Harold Hopkins and then with the Karl Storz to take the invention of Hopkins and put it into a scope and make it useful. And so George was always looking to the better scope. To this day, he doesn't leave me alone. George is 96 years old, and my phone rings every month or so. And he says to me, I want you to look at this video that I'm going to send you because I have a new idea. And I want you to see what you think of this new choledocoscope that we just put together. It's smaller, and it's a chip camera instead of fiber optic. And you know what? He's right. It's beautiful. And then I have another scope called the VTOME, where you mount it above the table and a cardiac surgeon can do the anastomosis on TV without loops. He's always thinking. When I go with him, even today, to SAGES, and we walk through the exhibit hall, he looks at every instrument, and I have photographs of him doing this. And he doesn't look at the instrument for what it is today. He looks at the instrument for what it could be with improvement. He has a unique perspective on technology, and he always asks what could be, not what is. With laparoscopy, everything changed when we went to lap chole because the video endoscope was there. We had it all on TV. But it wasn't there in the beginning. George Berci and I in the beginning were trying to do therapeutic procedures, and he did. I was an amateur. But to be able to hold the scope to your eye and then do a manipulation, nobody in the room knew what you were doing but you. So the video camera changed everything. George was trying to take out the gallbladder before video was available. Well, a number of us were dabbling, but when lap chole hit, everybody recognized it was important. The question was, how were you going to get trained and who was going to teach you? So the persons who were important in this country was Eddie Joe Reddick and Doug Olson, who were in Nashville, and you had Barry McKernan and Bill Say, who were in Marietta, Georgia, who really did the first one in this country. And Reddick was having courses, and they cost money because it cost him money, but he was doing commercial courses almost to teach it, and then SAGES got involved. SAGES says this is something we have to do better. First we have to train the trainers, and then we'll train the populace, but we need to train the trainers. Who were the first people that were taught? I remember people like John Hunter and Nat Soper, John Sakier was there, George Berci, and they had courses. Okay, they were the trainers. They learned first, and then then they took the SAGES board members and stuff, and my partner was Larry Way. Okay, and Larry Way was San Francisco. We were lab partners, and we did this in Pigs in Salt Lake City. And then you took the course, and you said, okay, I'm going to start, but then you couldn't get instruments because they couldn't manufacture enough instruments. And so who did you know that could get you instruments? You had to know somebody. I was lucky. I knew George Berci, who knew Storz, so we got instruments at Mount Sinai in Cleveland. We waited. I mean, you didn't have many instruments. You waited to get a hook, and you used a lot of GYN instruments. Oh, yeah, we used a lot of GYN instruments. And their trocars, you went and raided the cabinet. But then you would get a whole set of instruments and get going. Common duct exploration, ironically, was one of the earliest things we did because it didn't require a lot of special technique. And so people to this day who aren't very good in lap common duct, I can tell them the story of it's the safest thing to do because if you know there's stones in the common duct, you can see the common duct is dilated. You just pull on the cystic duct and wipe the peritoneum off the top of the common duct, and you poke a hole in it with the little scissors, and you make an incision, and the bile and the stones start coming out, and you can use a Fogarty balloon to pull out all the stones, and then you can put the choledocoscope in and go up and down, but then you put a T-tube in, and the question was, I couldn't suture, how are you going to close it? I wasn't good at tying knots. I'll tell you this, what we did in those days is I'd hold the two ends up and twist it like a twisty and put a clip on it, right down where I tied it. Just pull up the two ends, twist it till it was tight, and put a clip on it. That was before I knew how to suture. And then we learned how to suture. So those were the things that we did in the early days, when SAGES was starting to become recognized as a force in American surgery. And the American Board of Surgery said, we are going to give SAGES a seat on the American Board of Surgery. And so SAGES was required to put up 3 names, and the board chooses who they want. I was nominated to be one of the people for the board. Little did I think that I might be chosen, and one day they called me and said, you've been selected to be on the board. I was the first SAGES member to ever be on the board. I had a great time on the board, and I was surprised by the people on the board. The people on the board were terrific. Courtney Townsend came on the board shortly after I did. He was just a wonderful man. He and I spoke very strongly in favor of another guy who was from SAGES to be on the board, and that was Steve Stain. Steve Stain went on the board of Surgery, and he was a SAGES member. And another guy, Michael Nussbaum, was then elected, and he was a SAGES member. So now we had a few people on the board who were SAGES members, and were able to contribute to the board in terms of what we thought, and the questions came up at the board. How much endoscopy should a surgical resident do? And the board asked me. And I said they should do a lot. But then we had to negotiate with the residency review committee, who was run by Joe Fisher at that time. And so we had to come up with a realistic number, and numbers are never the answer, but we came up with some numbers, and the board started to say that surgery must do endoscopy. And SAGES was involved. Ironically, later on, Joe Beisky became an administrator of the board, and Joe Beisky was president of SAGES at some point. So we had several people from SAGES who were involved with the board. You have people today who are, you have people who've been on the board like John Hunter and others who SAGES is all out throughout the board now. It's not a matter of whether they're SAGES members, how many are members of SAGES, because a lot are. Then one day I was asked to be the chairman of the board, which was elected by the membership, which was really sort of amazing that somebody who was the first member from SAGES could ascend to be the chair of the board, which was kind of great. And it recognized the importance, I think, of the contributions of SAGES to American surgery. Family, in my opinion, is the important contribution to the world. And people say to me, what's the most important thing in your life? And they expect you to say your career and the things you've contributed. And I tell them that all of these are wonderful. Your work is wonderful. But the day that you resign from your great position as chairman and you expect them to sing your praises forever, what they're really talking about is who's the next in line for your office. So I think that that's nice. Your career should be rewarding and you should be able to contribute, but I believe that your family is really the key. And that may be, everyone has a different kind of family, and it doesn't matter. I think you have to have interests and enjoyment outside of your career. And I was thinking, I had small kids, I was going to go home, but I sort of looked from office to office, and they were all sitting there reading their journals. And they'd stay there till 9 o'clock at night, and I said, I'm not doing this. So I would put all my stuff in a big shopping bag, all my work, and I would sneak down the back stairs so they didn't see me, and I would go home, and I would have dinner with my family, and then we would have study hall at the dining room table, clean it off, and I would help all the kids with their homework, or my wife would help them, or we'd help each other, and I would do my work and they would do their work. And this became our family's way of, behaving. If I had to go back later, I would go back later, but this was what we would do. The kids grow up fast. Two of them became surgeons. My oldest, Lee, became a urologist, and he does minimally invasive stuff. He's superb. He's the head of urological oncology at Case Western. And my second son, Todd, is a pediatric surgeon, very interested in surgical education.
You have taught me morals and values. You've taught me how to be a good person. You've taught me how to be a great surgeon.
My third son is in real estate development, and my daughter is my fourth, my baby, and she just had twins. And I have 10 grandchildren and 4 kids, and they're all in Cleveland, so I see them every week. Yeah, Jackie, as I said, was always there to give me advice and to give me good counsel. I think that a marriage, and we've been married 48 years, a marriage is something that you have to work on like a career. People think that they're going to fall in love, and this is advice I give young people. They think they're going to fall in love like in a movie. Like Harry Met Sally, we're going to fall in love and it's going to be great. But it isn't like that. It's like you make the decision to marry someone and you're in love, and that's great, but now the work begins. Because you come home and they have a good day and you have a bad day, or vice versa, you both have bad days. And you have to stop and think, wait a minute, what's the other person going through? What can I do to help them? How can I make their life better? What am I doing to aggravate them? And some of the things you'll correct and some of the things you may never correct. It is interesting to understand what makes people tick and understand that the work you put in to having a partner, make sure that your relationships with your partner are rich and that you give to these people as well as take. Because relationships aren't just on like a movie. They take a lot of work. Sometimes you just have to get away and talk to each other. Real life is different. Real life means that you have to have bad times and good times, and what you put into it, you get out of it. And I look at 48 years of marriage and say, that's my crowning achievement. I think the future is always going to keep changing. It doesn't just come and end. People think that if I learn this new stuff, I'll be done. The future keeps changing. Laparoscopic surgery is now, and in the future we're going to do image-guided surgery. You may be putting a needle into something and cooking it like we do with liver tumors, for example. We have to be able to embrace every new idea and test it and see if it works. When a new technology comes out, we have to be there. We need to think about the future and not live in what we do today. And so people should always say, what's next? George Berci does this every day. That's his gift. He doesn't stop now. He says, that's not good enough. What are we going to do tomorrow?